Today, we're going to look at the preservation of life and what we ought to do to sanctify life. And we're going to look at the relationship of wealth to that. And in particular, we're always going back to the Quran and the Sunnah in our teachings. So the sanctity of life. The Quran informs us, as you all know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us from a single being or nafs, right? And that is the same concept that is used to denote hifz in nafs, or the preservation of life in English. So the concept of nafs from that one single verse or ayah in the Quran shows us how it connects humanity like no other concept. So humanity is bound together by this incredible single source. And that single source, if you look at other ayat of the Quran and other hadiths, you will find is flavored with mercy. So mercy is the moral and physical connection between all of humanity. So when we read that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed upon the children of Israel that he who kills a nafs or corrupts in the earth is as if he killed all people, and he who revives a nafs is as if he revived all people, we recognize the truth of the sacredness of life. When you think that we all came from this one nafs, that in one way or another, we are all related. This is where this comes from. So when one of us is intentionally killed without right, it is as if all of humanity has been killed. And we're not just talking here about physical death. Okay, so killing somebody isn't necessarily taking their life. It doesn't only involve that. It involves taking their dignity. It involves not being part, like we spoke last week, of a broader environment and system that actually enables people to live. And the same goes for reviving a nafs. So obviously we do not bring back people from the dead, but reviving a nafs is helping people in various ways, helping them materially, but also helping them morally in this revival process. So it's also important to understand in the Quran that the sanctity of life is not limited to humans. It extends to animals, and it even includes insects, where we read in the Quran that they are divinely inspired. The Quran tells us that there's not a creature in the earth or the skies that does not form communities like ours. Allah also says in the Quran that he does not disdain from, he does not shy away from giving the example of a gnat or a flea and everything that is above it. So as for those who believe, they know that it is the truth from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And those who do not have faith question, what does this mean? And it goes on to tell us, well, those that question what this means, that don't recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pointing out this very vulnerable creation, because he has commanded us to keep our covenants, to keep our promises, and not to sever what he has commanded to be joined. And it's important to realize that that is the basis of connectivity between humanity and between everything created, how we are all part of this incredible web of life that is interdependent, as we're going to see later today. And there's this beautiful hadith where we are basically instructed, if an ant bites you, you're not permitted to kill the entire colony. You know how we go get a bottle of spray and then we kill the entire colony? You're actually not allowed to do that. There was a prophet from the old times that commanded that. You know, he was bitten by an ant and he commanded that the whole colony be killed. And he was reprimanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. God basically said to him, would you kill an ummah that glorifies my praises? So we have to be cognizant that the sanctity of life is that sensitive in Islam. I mean, if it is that sensitive to an ant, you can imagine what it is towards higher life forms or towards human beings. So we're given lessons in the Quran as to what happens when we betray this sanctity of life. And there's five main big lessons that happen when this is generalized, when destructing the sanctity of life is generalized. The first is related to political structures that are characterized by tyranny or oppression on the one hand, and corrupts people, citizenry, or subjects on the other. And basically what that means is we can potentially live in systems where the politics of the situation renders some people, some groups oppressed and impoverished. And obviously that is a betrayal of the sanctity of life. The other big example that we're given is one of economic structures that privilege the powerful few, including inequitable income and goods distribution, unfair market regulations, the allowance of certain goods or services or other transactions that are immoral or that promote immorality, and excesses against nature and other living creatures. So the Quran also talks about the betraying of the sanctity of different forms of life through economics. It also talks about the betrayal of life through social structures that privilege certain individuals or groups over others, whether based on gender or race or creed or any other superficial division that subjects one or several groups to another. The fourth betrayal of the sanctity of life and human dignity is related to sexual morality or behaviors within a society that reflect an intentional neglect of rules of discretion and privacy, or that exploit a certain element in society for particular interests, commercial or otherwise. And the final big betrayal is that we distort our religious convictions to believe that any of the above actually come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or we attribute them to God. Okay, so those are the five big areas or general areas where when we betray the sanctity of life, or the ways in which we betray the sanctity of life and the consequences that happen afterwards. So how do we guard the sanctity of life? What do we do to guard our dignity, life in its broad form, not just in staying alive, but in flourishing as human beings and in enabling, as we talked about in the maqasid, other life forms to pursue their purposeful paths? There are three big relationships in Islam. The first is our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is fundamentally the most important. The second is our relationship with ourselves, which we touched upon a little last week, but we'll talk about more today. And the third is our relationship with everyone and everything else. So let's take one at a time. So our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For believers, this is the most fundamental relationship. We read in the Quran, and I did not create the jinn and humans except to worship me. وَمَا خَلَقْنَا الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. So we have this concept that our ultimate purpose in life is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This idea of worship, however, is not just the rituals. To worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically to perform any duty with his pleasure in mind, anything. So even what we do in our professions, what we do in our homes, everything we do with that intention is considered a form of worship. Now, this kind of relationship is one of dependence. We depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as opposed to the other two relationships, which are interdependence and interdependence. Allah is unique, obviously, with no partners, and we depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for our spiritual practices, for our moral development, for our intellectual development, and for our, as we're going to talk later, our provision in this life and in the next. All of us depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for sustenance. So how do we know Allah? How do we nurture this relationship? Well, one avenue is for us to be familiar with his names. We read in the Quran, Allah, there is no deity except him. To him belongs the best names. We also know from hadith, Allah has 99 names, 100 minus one, and whoever knows them will go to paradise. So what do we mean by knowing them or by knowing Allah? To know his traits, to know the meaning of these names. So I have some arrows here, for instance, Ar-Rahman, to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is merciful. He is the giver of mercy, Ar-Rahim. To know what that means, that is a very tangible trait. That is not an abstract idea. To be merciful is to actually behave with mercy, not just to say it. To bring somebody a cup of water is mercy. To feed a cat is mercy. To be kind to one's spouse when you might have a tendency to be angry or upset is a mercy. All of these things are the actualization of mercy. We have Ar-Razzaq, which we're going to talk about later today. Ar-Razzaq is the provider. It's a very important concept for Muslims to understand what that means. What does it mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides us? What does that mean in terms of the efforts that we put in versus what we receive? Al-Qabid, meaning the withholder. This is another extremely important name for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to understand what that means. So take the example, and maybe some of you have experienced this in your lifetime. When you try to do something good for somebody, or you try to give something, but it's not accepted from the other side, not because the other person doesn't want to accept it, but it is simply not portioned for them. This is the meaning of, part of the meaning of al-qabid, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though you are doing your best to try to give, it is not getting to its destination because its destination is not apportioned that giving. And we can talk about it later in question. It's a very interesting concept. And you can go through the other names over time and learn what they mean. Learn it within the context of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that of all of his names, he wrote mercy upon himself. And his mercy has encompassed everything. So all of your understandings have to go back to that hegemonic trait of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You also must know from the Quran what Allah loves and who he loves. So Allah loves those who do good, those who are just, those who are patient, those who are pious, those who put their trust in him, those who follow him. And again, you will learn about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as you reflect upon the Quran. You will also learn about what he dislikes. So he dislikes evil actions. He dislikes the aggressors. He doesn't like those who are just, or those who are treacherous, or those who are arrogant, or those who are unfaithful. He doesn't like those who broadcast vile words. He doesn't like those whose words betray their actions. Again, when you do the reflections on the Quran and you live with the Quran, you will learn about what Allah loves and what Allah doesn't love, and who he loves and who he doesn't love. And that's very important for nurturing your relationship with him, just as you would nurture it with, a friend or a spouse or anybody you love in this world. You strive to understand what they like and what they don't like, and how you can better yourself within that context. But the beautiful thing about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our relationship with him is that even though it is dependent, it is reciprocal. So there is a beautiful hadith qudsi, or sacred narration, that states, "Whosoever shows hostility to someone devoted to me, I shall be at war with him. My servant draws not near to me with anything more loved by me than the religious duties that I have enjoined upon him or her. And my servant continues to draw near to me with supererogatory works, so that I shall love him. When I love him, I am his hearing with which he hears, his seeing with which he sees, his hand with which he strikes, and his foot with which he walks. Were he to ask something of me, I would surely give it to him. And were he to ask me for refuge, I would surely grant him it. I do not hesitate about anything as much as I hesitate about seizing the soul of my faithful servant. He hates death, and I hate hurting him." It's a very, very beautiful relationship that we establish with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that gives us security and comfort and ensures that we respect this sanctity of life. The second important relationship is with yourself. In this second relationship, we have to nurture who we are. We read in the Quran, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. So you and I are the first point of concern. If we are not in a good state, nothing else is in a good state. And even though our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is first in terms of importance, we will not be able to maintain even that relationship if we are not well and healthy. So this is a relationship of intradependence, not independence. Nobody is independent. Islam does not talk about independence because it's not possible. You cannot live without the food that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings forth from the earth. You cannot have lived without your mother having given birth to you. You cannot live without the social relationships within which you are embedded. It is a matter of intradependence or interdependence, not independence. So in intradependence, you are developing that relationship with yourself. You're ensuring that your nature does not control you, that you control your nature in order to flourish. So one of the things you have to know is your purpose. Now, we have multiple purposes in life. Nobody has just one purpose, but sometimes in different phases of our lives, especially as women, one purpose will take precedence over the other. And the Quran makes this clear. You know, we see this in the lives of women in the Quran, we see it in our own lives. And so it's important to give yourself that space. You know, when someone says, should a woman work or not work? It depends on the time of her life. It depends on what phase we're talking about in her life. Should I have children? Should I not have children? Well, all of us know that children are within a certain, time or duration within our lives for those of us who've had kids or want to have children. It's the same thing with work. It's the same thing with, different activities and hobbies. It depends on the phase in our life. And so purposes will vary and tend to be flexible that way. But without this determination, as I said, it is difficult to value and prioritize what you must do to take care of yourself. Ultimately, however, you're doing what you do for the pleasure of Allah. And as I said, we know, and I just wanted to point this out, that women have taken on tremendous roles in our history. They've transmitted hadith, they've produced scholarly commentaries on the Quran, they've written in jurisprudence or fiqh, they've given fatwa, unlike nowadays where they're not really in that field, but historically they were. They've applied their knowledge, Islamic and otherwise, to medicine, astronomy, chemistry, governance, economics. They've been in teaching, in defense, in psychology, in community. Women were in everything. There's this beautiful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ visiting Haram, which is a woman he used to visit. Sometimes he would eat there, sometimes he would nap there. And in one of the events where he was there and he napped, he woke up laughing or smiling. And she said, well, why? And he basically said to her, I saw that there's going to be a military expedition. And she said, oh Allah, Prophet, pray that I be among them. Pray to Allah that I be among them. So he invoked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that she be among them. And then he fell asleep again. And when he got up, he was smiling again. And she said, why are you smiling? And he relayed the same story, but she said again, pray that I be among them. He said, I did, and you will be the first among them. And indeed, she was with the military expedition. And when her horse disembarked, or her mount disembarked from the ship, when they arrived in Cyprus, she fell and she died. And there's a mosque there in her name. But it goes to show you how the Prophet was not against women joining military expeditions or going on ships and fighting with the men. He actually invoked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for her to join them. And she did. So women have always played these magnanimous roles as part of their purpose in life. And throughout this, what keeps us well and keeps us grounded and keeps us balanced are the rituals of our faith. And especially, and I want to emphasize this evening, prayer. Never, ever neglect your prayer. Your prayer is, in Arabic, it's not prayer, it's salah. Salah comes from the root sila, or your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your connection with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, your connection with all of the other beautifully spirited people around the world, from the past, from the present, and from the future. So your salah is an incredibly important dimension of your day, to stop everything and say the next few minutes are for that incredibly important moment where I will situate myself in the past, in the present, and in the future, where I will situate myself in relation to my Lord and in relation to the Prophet ﷺ, and all of the incredibly beautiful souls of this world. That is what I would emphasize of the things that are asked of us. The third and final relationship that we focus on is interdependence, which is our relationship with everyone and everything else. This ought to be a mutually beneficial relationship. However, the Quran points us to the fact that not all relationships we're going to understand the wisdom of them. And this is where revelation is important, that we still maintain those relationships that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to maintain. And you all know that we are created from alaq. خلقنا الإنسان من علق. Alaq means not what you read in the translations. It doesn't mean a clot or coagulated. That's not what that means. A alaq simply means something that clings, something that attaches itself. And indeed, that is the physiological process when a embryo comes into being. It must attach to the mother's uterus in order for it to become a baby. So we are created from this primordial instinct to attachment, this interdependence, this being part of societies, part of communities, this needing others. That is something we are created of, and it is something we must maintain to maintain the sacredness of life. Now, how do we do it? Approach the world with mercy is the first thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as I said in the beginning, is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, and we are commanded as well to be merciful. Allah says, my rahmah extends to all things, and the Prophet was not sent but as a mercy to the worlds. And we know that the Prophet was very gentle in nature. In fact, he was told that had you been harsh-hearted, they would have dispersed from around you. He himself told us, show mercy to everything on earth so that he in the heavens will have mercy on you. Sorry. The other way that we deal with others is through pardon. So mercy is complemented through pardon. And we read in the Quran, choose pardon, خذ العفو وأمر بالعرف, and command in a way that is customary, and avoid the ignorant. وأعرض عن الجاهلين. And then what the Quran does is something beautiful. It tells us to give pardon, to give amnesty, to be humble in the face of things that we may become arrogant in the face of. So in this last one here, and not those graced with virtue among you, and means not give to the relatives and the needy. And virtue here means that you're chaste, you know, you're a pure person. But don't let that make you feel that you're above everybody. That if you see or know of someone has, you know, God forbid, committed zina or is behaving that way, that you are only the way you are because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has graced you and saved you. And so when the Muslims ask, what should we dispense? What should we spend of? The Quran tells you, pardon. Give pardon to people when you see them at fault, because Allah is oft forgiving, merciful, and never think that the grace and beauty in which you find yourself, that is because of you. That is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has graced you and has been merciful with you. So we are asked to be merciful in return. But we're also encouraged to interact and reform with society. So be merciful, give pardon, but at the same time, be proactive in reform and in correcting society. A Muslim who mixes in society and bears its harms is better than one who does not mix with people and cannot tolerate them. And that is a hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Whoever sees an evil, he must change it with his hand. If he's not able to do so, then with his tongue. If not, then with his heart. And that is the weakest form of faith. So we have many examples within the Quran and the Sunnah of the importance of being proactive to preserve life in all of its forms. And of course, this is a mutual relationship. It is incumbent upon women as it is incumbent upon men, and hopefully in collaboration or cooperation with each other, not one without the other. And as a final note on the sacredness of life, we must say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate recipient. In an incredible hadith Qudsi, or sacred narration, we read, "O children of Adam, I was ill and you did not comfort me." And the person on the day of resurrection will proclaim or exclaim, "O Lord, how could I have comforted you, the Lord of all worlds?" And God will reply, "Did you not know that such and such of my servants was ill and you did not comfort him? Did you not know that if you had done so, you would have indeed found me with them? O children of Adam, I asked for food, but you did not feed me." And the person will exclaim, "O Lord, how could I have fed you, Lord of the worlds?" And Allah will say, "Did you not know that such and such of my servants asked you for food and you did not feed him? Did you not know that if you had done so, you would have found it with me? O children of Adam, I asked for a drink, but you did not give me to drink." And the person will say, "How could I have given you to drink, Lord of the worlds?" But Allah will reply, "Such and such of my servants asked you for a drink, but you did not give it to him. Did you not know that if had you given it to him to drink, you would have found it with me?" So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate recipient when we have that intention in the good that we do. And what is the role of wealth in all of this? Well, obviously, most of you can see that wealth does play a significant role. Yes, there is mercy. Yes, there is pardon. Yes, there is proactivity that may not involve material comforts, but ultimately wealth is very important in the world in which we live today. So we all know that the top 1% of households globally own 43% of all personal wealth. 0.1% own 25% of the world's wealth, and the bottom 50% own only 1%. Now, we do have these systems within Europe and North America and elsewhere that lessen this inequality, but that tends to get threatened with demographic and religious diversity. And this is something for Muslims to contemplate and to think about and to work towards fixing. Islam obviously emphasizes the provision, wealth, and spending. Our overriding belief is that death and life were created to test us. Who is the best among us in works or deeds? And preserving life requires that we understand that. And we understand, as I said in the beginning of this talk, the importance of understanding provision, understanding rizq. Because without that understanding, humans tend to be very greedy, and our systems tend to be based on growth without the requisite distribution of wealth. In the opening of the Quran, we read that ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون. So of what we gave them, they spend for the needy, for the orphans, for their families. It's this, in order to have taqwa, in order to be heedful, those people that can benefit from the guidance in the Quran are also those that spend of their wealth. And we all know that zakah is a very big part of the Muslim spending, but we even must go beyond that. The zakah for most of us, if you think about it, it's not that much. 2.5% is very, very little, and most of us can go beyond it. We read in Surah Al-Ma'un, for instance, "Have you not seen the one who denies the truth of the deen? For that is the one who drives away the orphan and does not exhort the feeding of the needy. So woe to those who pray, who are neglectful of their prayer, those who show off and withhold aid or assistance." This is Surah Al-Ma'un, and it is very telling, of a person that denies the truth of the Islamic way of life, who looks away from those people that are in need, whose prayers and what they do in the world are just for show. And in reality, when they see people with real need, not just material wealth, but any kind, ma'un is assistance in general, they're not there to help. So we must, when we talk about the preservation of wealth, put it within this understanding of wealth as a temptation, right? The Quran tells us on several occasions, your wealth and your children are but a trial, and with Allah is the great reward. And that trial please understand, is not necessarily that your wealth or your children, God forbid, turn out to be less than what you expected, or they don't take the path that you had hoped for. Sometimes the child is perfectly beautiful and perfect and going on the right path, but they distract you. They distract you from building your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They distract you from building the relations to other relationships in your society, in your community, in your family that you are responsible for. So it's not always that they turn out to be a bad thing. They can turn out to be a good thing and still be a trial. So we have to be cognizant of that. We have to have what I call a rizq mentality. And a rizq mentality is a heart that understands that everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted us is a gift from him. Absolutely everything. There is a difference between your striving for something and the reward that you get in return. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like Sittana Hajar, when she was running in between Safa and Marwa during Hajj, she was running between the two mounts, not knowing that she would eventually have water. She was running in a desert, but she did her part. Her part was to search for the assistance or the aid. And then it finally came. And that is to teach us that what is asked of us is to strive, is to work hard. And the rizq or the provision is ala Allah. It is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we accept that, when we give of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us back, not only in this life, inshallah, but in the life to come. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us, "Man dha alladhi yuqridu Allah qardan hasan?" Who will loan Allah a beautiful loan? He will multiply it for you and he will forgive you. He is thankful and forbearing. So what is this beautiful loan? It's not metaphoric. The beautiful loan is actually when you consciously make the niyyah, the intention to lend Allah something or all of your life and your wealth. It is going above and beyond. So for instance, if you have a clinic, then maybe for 2 hours on Friday, you can give services to the poor solely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not even wanting thanks for them. We don't want from you any reward or thanks. This is lending Allah a beautiful loan. It is to go above and beyond what is asked. And it could be of personal effort or it could be of material comforts. So who is it that will lend Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a beautiful loan to preserve their wealth in this life and in the life to come? And of course, Islam encourages giving. They ask you what they should spend. Say whatever you spend of good, khair, for your parents, for relatives, for orphans, for the needy, for the wayfarer. Allah is well aware of what we do. As a final note though, we must be careful to be moderate and reasonable. The idea that we spend, what Allah gives what gives us, but we do so within reason. Ka'b ibn Malik wanted, for instance, to give up all of his wealth for not participating in the Battle of Tabuk. And the Prophet ﷺ responded by saying, keep some of your wealth, for it is good for you. So the idea is to not extend so much that you become blameworthy, but at the same time, to not withhold so much that you become in the realm of the greedy. So the pursuit of wealth is halal. In Islam, it is actually required if you have the capacity to build your wealth, to give. I always say that to people who say to me, I don't need the job. I can do it, but I don't need it. And I say, but you were given the education, you were given the capacity to do it. If you don't need the rizq that can come of it, then give it to somebody who does need it, who didn't have the beautiful opportunities that you had. Have that responsibility towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And let us end on that beautiful note, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Basma. This was, again, very, very insightful and very rich. Really a lot there to think about. I really like to ask you a couple of things, or discuss with you a couple of things that kind of made me think while you were talking about this. So in terms of beautiful learn, what made me think about the way you described it and how then connecting it to kind of risk mentality, I want you to just kind of comment on this concept of concepts of submission and obeying divine will, because I think there is a distinction between, and we often fall into this obedience kind of obedience mode, where it's all about fear and reward. It's usually about that, while submission is, I think, again going back to the previous lecture from last week, is really kind of internalizing the sublime nature of divine. And then when you think about this concept of beautiful alone and risk mentality, it really comes alive, because you don't do it out of fear, you don't do it out of just reward of that kind of thing. It's just really trying to live with those 99 names as much as possible. So if you can comment on that, reflect on that. I hope it wasn't too complex.
No, it's a pretty complex question. You're very correct in explaining or presenting the idea that Islam is not based solely or mostly on fear and reward. We have to distinguish between the way Islam was presented to us growing up and Islam is presented to us from the minds of scholars and jurists and other thinkers, and what the Quran and what the Sunnah actually tell us. So what the Quran and the Sunnah actually tell us is that fear and reward is a small part. You will notice in the Quran, fear is the word khawf. Khawf is used very sparsely in the Quran compared to taqwa, for instance. And if you're reading a translation, unfortunately, you're probably going to read the word fear multiple times, where in Arabic it's taqwa, where it's heedfulness, not fear. And so we fall in this fear reward trap. But to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to love doing good is neither fear nor because you're going to get a reward. It's because you actually love him. I mean, it's like loving, I don't even compare it to loving a human being, but it's like when you love a human being, if you bring it down to that example, you don't expect anything in return. You just hope that the person loves you back. That's about it. So fear and reward is one aspect, but the Quran appeals, as we said last week, to our intellect. The Quran appeals to our reason. And that's where you're very beautifully linking this idea of a beautiful loan. He leaves it to the trust in human thinking, to your autonomy. How can I lend Allah a beautiful loan? You have to stop at that verse and ask, what has he given me that I can give back to humanity as a loan to him, subhanahu wa ta'ala? And not even, subhanAllah, when you do it that way, it's not even because, as he says, he's going to repay you manifold. It's because it's beautiful. It's because he prefaces it with, it's a beautiful thing. You want to be part of that. And you have to use your intellect and you have to use your reason for that. And you have to understand the concept of rizq. You have to understand that the provision you have is what permits you. If you focus very quickly in Surah Al-Insan, this is my favorite surah in the entire Quran, and it brings me to tears every time. Because listen what he tells you. He says, those who feed, those who, يطعمون الطعام على حبه مسكينا ويتيما وأسيرا, those who feed people out of love for him. The needy, the orphan, and those in bondage or those in slavery. And then they say, we are not feeding you, we are feeding you for the fear of a day, when we're going to need Allah's help. And Allah says, فَوَقَاهُمُ اللَّهُ شَرَّ ذَلِكَ الْيَوْمِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects them from a day like that. And so listen to this. This is the beauty of it. So Allah gives us rizq, he gives us provision so that we can do something beautiful in our lives and become fulfilled so that he can give us Jannah. How incredibly beautiful is that? So he provides so that he can provide more. Basically, you're just this key in the middle that if you focus, if everybody today, we're in Ramadan, it's beautiful, go and read Surah Al-Insan, read that surah and think about what he's telling you. He's telling you, once upon a time you were a nothing, and then I put two paths in front of you. Are you going to take the hard path, or are you going to take the easy path? The hard path is, I want you to help people. I want you to help people in bondage. I want you to help the orphan. I want you to help the needy. And you're going to do it not because of yourself. You're going to do it because I gave you the ability to do it. I gave you the ability. I gave you the means to go to Jannah. And then if you do it for me, for the love of me, I will give you that Jannah. And now let me tell you a little bit about how crazy and beautiful that Jannah is. That is Surah Al-Insan. Insan, the person, the human. That is the sum of our lives. It's incredible, subhanAllah.
Yeah, but just when you mention insan, isn't Arabic like one of the meaning of word insan is the one who forgets often?
Yes, it could be, and that's why it starts with هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Has there not come, was there not a time when you were not even a mention? And then we created you. And we gave you sight and hearing and heart. We gave you these faculties. And then we put two paths in front of you. And look at you. Some of you will take that path, and some of you will take the other path. So you're very correct. It also does mean it's a reminder. It's a reminder of that you were nothing, but look at what I'm going to give you. Look at what I'm going to give you if you give. That nothing, that's something that was not even mentioned once upon a time, is going to be in paradise someday because of the rizq that I gave them. Subhanallah.
Subhanallah, indeed, it is very beautiful. And let's on kind of turning back a bit on that negative fear and life today, and the way we practice our religion, most of us in the West particularly, and not just in the West. I think it's actually in the Muslim majority countries too. And I think past few hundreds of years particularly have been quite difficult in that respect. And this kind of, again, talking about submission to God, which means refusing to be to submit to anything or anyone else. And fear, like what we mostly now are guided by, okay, will we have the work? Will we have this? Is this leader going to lead us to the war? Will we have democracy next year? Who will be elected? Mortgage, bank accounts. It's all about really fear. And we lose, I think, often perspective on exactly what you were talking about, on where does this risk come from? This all forms of risk, including peace, including comfort, including everything. And I think there is something to be, I think fear has definitely been a bigger portion now, even of Muslim life, than actual complete submission.
We've also lost, I agree with you 100%, we've lost what to fear, the real fear. We fear things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, don't fear that. Don't fear that. I will provide for you so long as you're doing your part. Obviously, you have to do your part. We just said sa'i. There has to be sa'i. Do your part, but don't fear. And if you face hardship, don't fear. It can be a trial. But so long as you're doing your best. So we have distorted our concept of what we fear, and we've given ourselves anxieties, and we've given ourselves mental health issues, and we've given, because of these distorted understandings of what we ought to fear and what it means to submit. To submit is what we spoke about today. To submit is to guard the sanctity of life, is to develop our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's very proactive, to develop our relationships with ourselves, to take care of ourselves, and to take care of others as well, because we're part of that web of life. If we don't take care of others, we will not be taken care of, so we have to put fear in its place. And we have to step out of the historical, the fear Allah, fear Allah, fear God. Islam is not like that. If you focus again, and it is so beautiful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, that's why I wanted us today to emphasize pardon. Allah is telling us, I pardon, I am merciful, and I am asking you to do the same. And in the Quran, he sets it up within what the so-called, religious-minded person or pious person would think. Those are horrible crimes. What do we dispense or spend when we're talking about gambling and intoxicants? He says, pardon. What do we dispense when we're talking about zina, when we think or we believe we're virtuous? Pardon. What do we dispense when the people of the book want to turn us away from our faiths? Pardon. What do we do when the kuffar approach us and they belittle and belie what we believe? Pardon. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you he pardons everything. He's asking us to pardon. In this life, we are not the judges. This faith is very different than, unfortunately, what many of us were born into and many of us were led to believe. But we have to reawaken the reason that we were talking about. We have to reawaken our reading of the Quran. We have to reawaken our insistence on properly understanding what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking of us when he asks us to submit. Not to be arrogant, to understand it's all it is. It's, if you're a virtuous person, it is. If you have the wealth, it is. If you're not the person that's stuck in gambling and alcoholism, and it is. So what he's saying to you, don't then turn around and think you're high and mighty and be judgmental of people. Pardon each other so you can live with each other in this earth in harmony and help each other. Help each other. Don't be judgmental. You were so lucky that you had that. Then don't look down on people. This is what the Quran is telling us.
Yeah. One question just to connect it to that. How do we then negotiate the pardoning with justice seeking? You mentioned it briefly, but I think sometimes it can be when we're faced with a injustice, whether in society, in our communities and families, which are quite obviously injustice. And how do we then, because especially when it comes to women, I think there is this burden of having, sabr and patience is always put on women more.
Yes.
And therefore pardoning. So how do we negotiate that?
You have to be in a position to pardon. And that's the problem with many of the fake reconciliation exercises that we see around the world, that people are not in the position to pardon. So when are you in a position to pardon? You are in a position to pardon when justice can be served. So the Quran tells us to pursue justice and to get justice is permissible and beneficial. But to pardon is better and to overlook is better. But what does that mean? The justice has to come first. So when we're talking about the case of women, what does it tell us in the Quran? It tells you, for instance, an example. We're going to be talking about family next week. But it tells you that, you have the right, if you are divorced before there's any intimacy, to keep, half the mahar that you were given, half the gift that you were given. Okay? You have that right. But to give back of it, that's up to you. So but you see how justice comes first. You have the right to half first, and you can keep it and walk away, and there's no problem with that. But if you of yourself feel that the half was, it's okay, I can give it back, I don't need to keep it, then that is your choice. See, the pardon comes after the justice. And this is for women, this is for everybody. To say pardon comes without justice is false, because it means I can't really pardon. I'm being forced. I don't know whether I'm actually pardoning or whether I was just put in a situation where I have to pardon. And then it's not a genuine pardon. It's not done with the niyyah, with the intention that this is a real pardon. For it to be intention of real pardon, I had to have had the opportunity to get my rights. And then to say, no, it's okay. I'm going to overlook, I will let this go. And you don't have to. You don't have to pardon. this is absolutely, this is a choice. Justice is first, the pardon is second, and the pardon is always higher. If you can bring yourself to that. If you can't, there's no wrong in it.
No, I think that's a very important thing. Like I said, particularly when we talk
Yes.
about women in society, and think that is very, very important
Yes.
thing to mention. I think we are about ending now. The time is run out fast, and it was really, really great to have this lecture. Really insightful, really beneficial. Last time I went away with lots of thinking time after that. So thank you very much again for this week, and really looking forward to next week.
Oh yes,
Inshallah.
next week. Family, marriage, engagement, children. It's going to be a field day.
So thanks to everyone else who joined us today, and we invite you to join us again next week, inshallah. And in the meantime, enjoy Ramadan and blessings of this beautiful month. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.